Welcome to our final set of notes for the year. It's almost hard to believe that here we are, and our last topic is pregnancy and development. So, in your notebook, this is on page 228, and let's get right into it. So, putting all these pieces together, there's a timing that has to happen for fertilization. So, we talked about the development of the secondary oocyte. That is only viable for 12 to 24 hours after it's ovulated from the ovary. And then sperm themselves only retain their ability to fertilize for 12 to 48 hours. But it is important to note that there are some sperm that have been known to be viable up to 72 hours. So we have to use that 72-hour timeline when considering the potential to become pregnant. Okay, so that gives us this window. But that sperm could be deposited in the body prior to ovulation, stay alive and viable within the body. Then the egg could be ovulated and the sperm is there. Or the egg could be ovulated and then the sperm could come later. Regardless, what happens in a normal process is the oocyte is released and is about 1/3 of the way down the uterine tube or the fallopian tube before the sperm reach it. So the sperm is inseminated in the vagina, normally near the area of the cervix. It is going to then work its way by swimming within the uterus, work its way up the fallopian tube, and then meet the egg. Now, once those sperm are there, they're at that corona radiata, and they have to work their way into the egg, and then only one is able to do that to actually go to fertilization. So, sperm propel themselves using their tails. If deposited at the time of ovulation, how do they know where the egg is? Let's say only one egg is ovulated. And I'm saying egg is a generalization. The proper term here should probably be secondary oocyte. Um, but if you hear me say egg, just realize we're talking about the oocyte. The oocyte releases a chemical from it, which diffuses, and the sperm can follow that chemical trail to know which fallopian tube to go in. Not all of them do that. And this is one of the reasons that even though there may be millions of sperm, only a few of them may actually reach the egg. Uh, Now, once they get there, it takes typically hundreds of their acrosomes to rupture and release enough enzyme to break down that corona radiata, which is protecting the oocyte. So again, we've got the parts of the sperm here. Um, Here's the nucleus with its 23 chromosomes. Here's that acrosome. Those acrosomes are going to work on this corona radiata. So that's going to break down those granulosa cells. And then eventually it works its way through the zona pellucida. And then one of them attaches to some receptors. And then that head opens up and puts in the nucleus. So now the nucleus is inside this actual ova or egg. Okay, once that happens, there's a chemical reaction in this zone here is sort of a jelly-like substance. The chemical reaction causes it to sort of harden or become impermeable. So now further sperm can't get through it, which is why only one sperm is going to fertilize this egg. So that single sperm makes contact with the membrane once it works its way through those layers, and then there's receptors there waiting for it. The head is pulled in to the cytoplasm, and this is a signal for it to complete meiosis, because remember, it was arrested in that. The oocyte has started its final divisions here, but it hadn't. So it's actually the sperm entering the egg that causes it to become a fully functional ova. And then that chemical reaction makes it impermeable to other sperm. So just kind of looking at the steps here, not going to spend a lot of time on this one. You can pause it and read it all or look at it in the Google Slides. But basically, they're showing you those acrosomes breaking it down, working it through the corona radiata, and then entering here. Okay. So what is fertilization? That occurs the moment the DNA of the sperm combines with that of the ovum. And so once this happens, this is going to be called a zygote, which is a fertilized egg. So this is the first cell of a new individual. It's got half of its chromosomes from mom, half from dad. We've got the diploid number again, in other words, 2n or two complete sets. So we've got all 46 chromosomes here now ready to go. So what are the events of development? The zygote now is in the upper third of the uterine tube. So it can't swim. It has to be moved by peristalsis and by cilia within the tube. All while that's happening, it's going through mitosis. So it's cloning itself. And so every time it copies and then divides itself, that's called cleavage. So it goes from 2 cells to 4 to 8, 16, 32, 64, and on and on and on. It just keeps doubling. While that's happening, the cells are getting smaller and smaller. The egg is actually much larger than a normal cell. It's the largest cell possible in the human species by itself. So then it divides and divides and divides without growth. So as soon as this thing starts dividing to 2, 4, 8 cells, it's now considered an embryo. So a lot of times people think of an embryo as looking sort of human-like, and it probably will around the 8th or 9th week. But even at the 8, 16, 32 cell stage, that is called an embryo. And so that causes some confusion among people. So the embryo may not even be implanted yet. Now, after 9 weeks, we're really going to call that a fetus. So here we see that the sperm have fertilized the egg. It's traveling down, so you have a zygote. It's dividing. Now it's a ball of cells, and this is going to be called a morula. We'll see that in a minute. It sort of hollows out and becomes a blastula or a blastocyst. And that's going to work its way down into the uterus, where it has to actually wait for a little bit yet until this lining is at the right timing, and then it's going to try to implant. So the developing embryo reaches the uterus about 3 days after ovulation. So during that whole time, it's going through cell division. At the 16 cell stage, we now refer to it as a morula, and it's basically a solid ball of cells. It's going to end up in the uterine cavity. And again, the endometrium, or the inner lining of the uterus, is not ready to accept it yet. It's going to continue its development up to a stage called a blastocyst. So this would be a morula. And so it's just sort of a ball of cells. Every single cell is identical. They're doing cloning. So right now, there isn't a lot of difference among the cells. This is giving you the idea of what's called blastulation. So this is a solid ball of cells. So if I had cut it in half, you see there's no space. But eventually, as it continues to divide, they move apart from each other and a fluid-filled center opens up. And basically, what we're looking at now is if I didn't cut it open, it would look like number 1 from the outside. So picture like a basketball is hollow. But if I cut it open, there's a thickness by the rubber material, but then there's a hollow space with air, right? Well, in this case, this is 1 cell thick, usually somewhere around 100 cells or so. And then this is filled with fluid. And so that's the blastocyst, a hollow cell. This is also called the chorionic vesicle. At this point, the cells are starting to differentiate. So some of the DNA is being turned on and activated, some of it's being suppressed or inhibited. And so different cells are starting to do different things based on their genetic instructions and chemical signals they're receiving. But one of the things that this blastocyst is able to do now is release a hormone. And this hormone is called human chorionic gonadotropin. It is similar to luteinizing hormone. So we call it luteinizing hormone-like. What's it do? This hormone, HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, gets into the bloodstream and it goes to the ovary where that corpus luteum is, and it tells the corpus luteum through this chemical signal to keep producing its hormones. Now, what are the hormones of that corpus luteum again? Progesterone. Progesterone is now going to go into the bloodstream, find its way to the uterus, and tell that endometrium to keep developing. It basically prevents it from being shed. So as long as we have an embryo, the embryo at this stage is called a chorionic vesicle, and it's producing this hormone, human chorionic gonadotropin. That is what is telling the corpus luteum to make progesterone. That's going to the uterus and telling it not to shed its lining. And so at this point, we have the potential for a pregnancy because that uterus is being prepared. This is what a home pregnancy test looks for in the urine. In the urine, human chorionic gonadotropin can show up. So this is also why somebody can't have intercourse and then the very next day take a pregnancy test and have it tell you anything. They really need to wait about 3 or 4 days here for this thing to develop enough to create this hormone that can be tested for. So now this blastocyst starts to divide unequally and add extra cells to one little side. So there's two parts to it now at this stage, the trophoblast and the inner cell mass. The trophoblast is a large fluid-filled sphere, and then the inner cell mass is a cluster of cells to one side. Now by day 7 after fertilization, this is really implanted in the endometrium. At that point, that is considered a pregnancy. So again, we go from a bunch of cells. Notice that these have tight junctions, one of our terms from earlier this year, and works its way up to a stage where it's going to be hollowed out but have this inner cell mass. Now, what does this inner cell mass do? This is the part that's going to divide and really be what's considered the embryo from now on. That'll go on to be the fetus and then later the baby. And the blastocele is what really is implanted into that uterine lining and is going to become part of the placenta. Remember, the placenta is an interface between the mother and the developing child. And therefore, there's got to be directions on how to build that. The directions for building that placenta really comes from the DNA of the baby, which is going to be in this segment. So now that inner cell mass is going to hollow out itself into a ball. And when it does that, it sort of pushes in and forms 3 layers. So we have an outer layer, an inner layer, and a middle layer. So ecto means outer, endo means inner, and meso means middle. And then derm, we think of like going to a dermatologist to study skin. In this case, it's kind of like referring to the outer skin, the inner skin. Okay, but in this sense, they mean it as a layer. Also, this term germ seems a little odd at first, but think about a plant germinating or growing. So in this case, germ refers to growth. So we've grown these layers. The outer layer, all of those cells specialize and eventually become the nervous system and your epidermis. The inner layer gives rise to all of the mucosa we talked about this year and glands, and the middle layer becomes basically everything else. Again, a little bit of an oversimplification, but we have an inner layer, a middle layer, and an outer layer that have formed. Now, how did those form? It formed by a process of sort of what they call invaginating or folding in. And so it starts as a blastula, goes to a stage called a gastrula. In that formation, it's called a gastrulation. We're really forming this inner layer. This is sometimes referred to as like the primitive gut. Okay, and then this also shows us the same thing. They're just kind of giving you an idea of what sorts of cell lines are going to specialize or differentiate and become different things. So implantation can happen at day 7, but it could take as long as 14 days later. So this gives us the idea. Now, what's happening at 14 days after ovulation? Well, ovulation takes place on day 14 or 15, pretty consistently based on that luteinizing hormone spike. So 14 days after that, in the classical sense, we're at 28 days. So that should be when the menses starts. If we have an implantation and it's releasing the correct hormones, that lining should not shed. So a woman should miss her period, and that might be an indication she's pregnant. Now, missing a period does not mean somebody is necessarily pregnant. There's a lot of reasons that could happen, and there's some people are very consistent in how they get their period, and some people are not. And so there's a lot of variability among people. We're just talking generally right now. So once implanted, that trophoblast becomes to form chorionic villi. So, what are chorionic villi? They're projections into the tissue of the mother's uterus that form the placenta. There is something called chorionic villi sampling. This is a method um, where they can go in and surgically cut off a little villi off the placenta. So that does not harm the baby because it's not part of the baby per se, it is part of the placenta. But the directions for how to make the placenta came from the DNA of the baby. So, what does that mean? It means that the DNA of the placenta matches the DNA of the baby. So if you want to do a genetic test on the baby without harming it, they can go in and cut off one of these. That is not a routine procedure. That is only done um, if they really feel there's a need for it. So maybe they want to do some genetic testing based on things they're seeing um, in checkups. Once the placenta has formed, the embryo is sort of now like a plate, and it gets surrounded by a special sac called an amnion. So the amnion is a fluid-filled pouch, and it surrounds the developing embryo. So when you talk about amniotic fluid, it is the fluid surrounding the baby. And then an umbilical cord attaches the embryo to the placenta, or in late stage, the baby to the placenta. They're going to cut off the umbilical cord once it's born, and that's going to become your umbilical region or the umbilicus, just what we would call the navel or the belly button. So here is a placenta, and here is the umbilical cord, and they're clamping it off and cutting it here. So there's two surfaces to the placenta. One side faces the fetus, one side faces the mother. And then the umbilical cord links them together. So after that's been cut, they need to clamp it, and eventually they apply special medicine to this. Eventually it dissolves off, it leaves behind a scar, and that's the belly button or the navel. Okay, so here's a newly born baby, and they're about to cut the umbilical cord. By the third week of development, the placenta has started to do a few things. It's delivering nutrients and oxygen to the baby, it's removing carbon dioxide and waste, and it's doing all of the major exchanges. So we have this picture here. Let's look at it a little bit closer up. We've got blood of the fetus and then fetal cells. So this is the barrier. We have blood of the mother and then the cells of the mother to block it. And we can transmit things by diffusion through this. But the blood of the baby and the blood of the mother, as we've talked about all year, it does not mix itself. The things suspended within the blood can dissolve through. So in this case, this illustration is showing us that there's a couple of different viruses that the mother can contract, and those viruses may have the ability to get to the baby's blood. But for our purposes, what we're trying to refer to here is oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nutrients. Now, jumping ahead to the end of the second month, the placenta now acts like an endocrine organ. And what it does is produce an estrogen, but the important one we want to mention here is progesterone. That's really important because the corpus luteum has been doing it up to now, and the corpus luteum is breaking down and it becomes inactive. Without progesterone from this corpus luteum, the lining of the mother could shed, and then that could be a miscarriage. So what we want is that progesterone of the placenta to maintain that lining. So by the 8th week here, the development of the organ systems are basically laid down in a very primitive form. And so from week 9 on, we normally now refer to that as a fetus. The effects of pregnancy on the mother there's many of them. We're going to go through the major ones, but pregnancy is considered the period from conception to birth. Now, from a medical standpoint, the definition of pregnancy is implantation, when you talk about when does life begin, there is no universal definition in terms of science. Um, so that can be a little bit of a contentious issue when you start looking at personal beliefs, beliefs based on religion, and among scientists when you look at the science itself. So that is a very complex issue. And what we're going to really talk about is just the definitions from a medical standpoint. So, with that, anatomical changes that are going to occur, the uterus enlarges and it takes up most of the pelvic cavity by week 16. It continues to push upward into the abdominal cavity, and eventually, near birth, that uterus could reach almost as high as the xiphoid process, which you will remember is the base of the sternum between your ribs. So here is a baby developing, and at the 5-month stage, what we can see is as it's growing, it's applying pressure obviously forward on the mother's skin and muscles. That shift of center of gravity tends to create an accentuated lumbar curvature here. So the spine has a natural S-shaped curve to begin with. This tends to become a deeper curve. It's going to push on the bladder. It's going to push on the intestines. It's going to crowd the intestines and the organs. And then it's also going to push on blood vessels and increase the blood pressure. So it crowds the organs, it pushes upward on the diaphragm. That can cause the ribs to actually flare out and widen the thorax, can change the center of gravity, accentuate that lumbar curvature, and this can also often result in back pains. Meanwhile, there's a hormone being released by the placenta called relaxin. It chemically targets ligaments and cartilage of the pubic symphysis, which allows them to actually become more flexible. And so that allows literally this cartilage to stretch apart more, and it can physically widen the skeletal structure of the hips. So this varies greatly genetically from person to person and conditions among individuals. But it is possible for a woman to give birth and then have her skeletal structure basically altered from the birth, meaning when that cartilage hardens, it may have the hips permanently widened. In terms of the developing fetus, while we like to say the woman is eating for two, just true, she doesn't need to double her calorie intake. On average, she only needs about 300 additional calories for the developing fetus itself. But those 300 calories need to be the proper nutrients. So, 300 calories from drinking soda wouldn't be the same thing as 300 calories from a proper set of nutrition. Okay, just looking at some of the stages here, we notice when this baby is first developing, and we're going to look at 4 months down here, that it's head up. Eventually, it's going to turn head down. And then we can see as this thing is growing how much it's pushing upward into these organs here. Okay, so we've got the stomach right here. The stomach's even being compressed. Physiological changes in terms of the gastrointestinal system. Morning sickness is very common in the first few weeks of pregnancy. In fact, that's one of the things that might cue a woman that she could be pregnant, in addition to missing a period. People get this in different degrees of severity. Sometimes they don't hardly get it at all. Sometimes it's really pronounced. But basically, it's the body adjusting to increasing progesterone levels. They might get heartburn. So remember what heartburn means. It's a reflux of stomach acid up into the esophagus. So normally food is going to come down the esophagus, go through that sphincter and into the stomach. And that prevents acid from going back upward into the stomach. Well, because the stomach is being crowded and pushed and the esophagus is being displaced, that junction isn't as tight, and it can get stomach acid up into the base of the esophagus, and then it kind of burns the lining there, and it's in the heart region, so we call that heartburn, right? Pushing on the digestive tract can also limit mobility of the movement of feces through the body, so that can cause constipation. In the urinary system, there may be the need or the urge to urinate more frequently because the bladder may have a smaller potential volume because it's being compressed, and we're filtering the waste of the baby, getting that waste into the mother's blood, and the mother's blood's doing the filtering, right? And so she's really filtering the waste of the baby as well. And then this uncontrollable need to urinate would be called stress incontinence. In the respiratory system, based on rising estrogen levels, that can target the mucous membranes of the nasal cavity, and that can cause a lot of stuffiness. Sometimes it can lead to nosebleeds. And then the vital capacity um, and the respiratory rate are altered based on the fact that the residual volume has to be lower because the diaphragm is being pushed upward. In the cardiovascular system, the blood volume increases by 25 to 40%, and this is partially to give um, more blood circulating to accommodate the needs of the fetus. In other words, more blood means we can carry more oxygen in it and we can deal with more waste. It's also a safeguard, though, against blood loss during childbirth. So if the mother has some bleeding or complications and she loses 25% of her blood, that would normally be a severe shock to the body. Now, this is going to cause shock to the body, but it's losing a percentage above what she normally has. So it's kind of a buffer volume. Um, we've increased the volume of the blood. So that's going to increase the blood pressure. And normally the pulse is going to rise also to accommodate that. So we've really increased our cardiac output by increasing our blood volume. Because of that additional pressure, it will often stress the veins, which should normally be under low pressure, cause them to stretch out, and that could cause varicose veins. Also, the venous return, or in other words, the blood returning to the heart through the veins from the lower limbs, can be impaired because the uterus is pressing so hard within the pelvis that it's actually constricting the blood vessels that pass through there. So think about some blood vessels we learned. Once that descending aorta gets down into the hips, it split and became common iliac arteries, and then that split and became femoral, and so on. Those things are being compressed now, and it's not allowing the blood to get back as easily. So again, look at the relative growth pattern here. At third month, 4 months, it's pushing upward, 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 and forward more. The act of childbirth itself is technically called parturition. So if you've heard of postpartum depression, we have that root word right in there. And so this is the act of childbirth. Usually occurs within 15 days of the calculated due date, which should be about 280 days from the last menstrual cycle. So that's generally how it's calculated. Labor is all of the events that are going to expel the infant from the uterus. And expel sounds kind of harsh, but that is the technical way that it's talked about. We're getting it out of the body, so we're expelling it. So what are the initial stages? Estrogen levels are going to reach their highest peaks during the last few weeks. And what that does is it causes the middle layer of the uterus, the myometrium, to form receptors to a hormone called oxytocin. And now it's much more sensitive to that hormone. This also interferes with the progesterone's role of quieting the influence of the uterine muscles. Remember, up till now, progesterone has been preventing the shedding of the lining because it's been needed to maintain the fetus. So sometimes women, well, often I should say, go into false labor, and this is called Braxton Hicks contractions. They're weak, they're irregular, and they feel like labor is coming on, but it's not really coming on yet. And so a woman who's never gone through this often believes the baby's coming, and she kind of gets tricked. Women who've gone through it before have a better sense of it because they've had that life experience. But regardless, before actual labor happens, normally there is these Braxton Hicks contractions. Now, That false labor is going to get converted into real labor as birth nears. So there's two chemical signals to look at. There are cells of the fetus that produce oxytocin. So the fetus itself is sort of determining the timing of its birth here. And the oxytocin is going to go to those receptors that were formed in the lining of, in the middle layer of the uterus. And it's also going to stimulate the placenta to release localized hormones that play an important role. So remember, we have two examples of positive feedback this year. Blood clotting and childbirth. So in positive feedback, we receive a signal and our body then says, make that signal stronger and stronger. And so these localized hormones make the signal stronger and they form a feedback loop. So we're releasing more and more of these hormones. The hypothalamus also tells the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin as well. And that is a big part of it. So that oxytocin, as it's surging now, not from the embryo itself, that sort of started it, but the hypothalamus releasing this is really causing increased contractions within the myometrium. Okay, so that is now going to be true labor. Now, just want to mention a couple of things that can happen. This is called an ectopic pregnancy. An ectopic pregnancy is when the embryo implants someplace other than the lining of the endometrium. It should be implanting somewheres in here, anywheres on here. But it could get what you call a tubal pregnancy, okay, an ovarian pregnancy, a peritoneal, an abdominal. At some point, when that egg was fertilized, it went the wrong way. It attached to something it shouldn't, okay? And so that's what's meant by an ectopic pregnancy. These are not something that come to term. Often this is something that has to be dealt with surgically. Stages of labor. Stage one is dilation. So dilation is comes from the appearance of true contractions. And one of the things that's happening is the cervix is increasing its opening diameter. And it's going to get up to about 10 centimeters. And so relaxin is playing a role, and this is making room for the head of the baby to be able to fit out. It's the longest stage of labor, takes normally 6 to 12 hours to occur. Once this has happened, the head of the baby, if it's in the correct position, should be pointing downward and pressing against the cervix. It's in that pouch called the amnion, and the pressure of its head pushing against this ruptures it, and that releases the fluid. So that now comes out of the woman's body, and that's called the water breaking, just a common term. When she says, oh, my water broke, that means this sac has torn open and she's really through a lot of that dilation stage. So now we move on from dilation to delivery. This is called expulsion or expelling the infant. So it's going to pass through the cervix and through the vagina, which sometimes is now called the birth canal, and out of the body. So the mother is experiencing what we would call natural childbirth as opposed to a C-section. She has the increased urge to bear down with abdominal muscles. So it's not just the uterus that just does it. She assists to increase the pressure by squeezing her abdominal muscles and helping to force the baby out. For the first child, this process is often 50 minutes long. For a second, third, fourth child, usually could be 20 minutes. Now, again, these are very generalizations that can vary from person to person quite a bit. So coming head out is what should happen, and that's called the vertex position. The head actually acts like a wedge to help dilate the cervix more. When the head comes out, it allows the baby the potential to breathe even before it has fully exited the birth canal. And then the rest of the baby is going to emerge much, much easier once the head is out. So this is the position that it should be in. Now, this would be considered a breech position, meaning upside down. This is also a type of breech. They call this a transverse lie. Problems with these, obviously, is if the feet tried to come out first, the head is last. How's the head gonna come out? It's gonna be pulled upon, and that neck is very delicate. And so now there's a great risk to the child in this position, and a great risk to the mother. Sometimes they can go in and actually turn the baby around, or there's ways to kind of manipulate it and get it in the correct position. Sometimes they can't, and they have to do an emergency C-section. So they may have to cut and then take the baby out that way. After birth, the baby is out of the body. The placenta is still in the body, and the umbilical cord is still attached. So the umbilical cord is coming out of the body and going inside. At that point, they clamp it and they cut it, as we discussed before. And again, breech is anything other than head down, and a cesarean section may be needed. So then we have the afterbirth. So about 15 minutes after the baby's been delivered and they're doing everything they need to care for that baby, the mother then delivers a second set of tissue. And this is the placenta and some of those tissues coming out of the body. So these are strong contractions that continue even after birth. Those contractions are also compressing the blood vessels of the uterus to limit bleeding, causes that placenta to detach and then come out. And then the other thing that's coming out is all those fetal membranes. So there's that amniotic sac still inside too. That's got to come out. And so then that gets removed. And that is some of the major points about pregnancy and development. Obviously, you could spend your entire life studying this topic and only scratch the surface. But it's hard to believe that is our last slide for the year. That really completes the new material for anatomy. And if you have any questions, let me know.